And that will be my biggest regret to this day, that I didn't fight for my son when I needed the most. First of all, I apologize if this is out of focus. I can't see my camera very well. Second of all, I am fighting against potential rain. My camera has only a limited battery and recording, so this may be in multiple parts. I apologize ahead of time. Third of all, I might include some photos at the end to kind of give illustration of everything that went down. Hello, fellow ribs, sinners, saints, and the glories of men. Welcome back to another video. Today, with the first birthday of my firstborn approaching and a potential miscarriage to be confirmed this week, I thought there is no better time than to talk about what got me in this situation in the first place, aka my birth story. Yay! It is a lot. I will give a fair trigger warning ahead. There is going to be a lot to be discussed. I don't think I could really put in simple trigger words about what's to go down. And if you're not in the mental space to be able to watch this, please save this for another time and come back later. I know when I was in pregnancy, trigger warnings, I'm not a gay liberal, so trigger warnings suck, but I think they were actually very helpful to me in pregnancy. So I'll do one exception there. But also, this is going to offend a lot of people, my story. It is controversial because it doesn't exactly fit into categories that make it easy for us to process. I think people from the medical community will be frustrated, maybe disappointed, maybe annoyed or triggered. I think freebirthing people will be disappointed and, I don't know, maybe scorn some of my decisions. It is very controversial for both birthing communities and pretty much everyone on the spectrum. So there is a high likelihood that you may be offended watching this video, but that doesn't negate the fact of what I went through. It doesn't negate my opinions of how I came to approach those decisions. And I hope to give you some insight as to why I chose the decisions that I did, as controversial as they may be. I also hope to provide some insight and reflections as to how to avoid my situation. Obviously, a large component of it is outside of my control, but I think there are certain principles that were super helpful and definitely mitigated what could have been a lot worse of a birth process and story, as bad as it is. So strap in. This is essentially my birth story. How I went from a free-birthing autonomous woman to someone who fought to keep my very self within the hospital system. I think it's important to start a little bit earlier than where most birth stories start, because that kind of helps factor into a lot of my decisions that I made. In 2018, I kind of began my trend back towards conservatism and conservative politics. This was, ironically, my first year at university, and just seeing the amount of gay libs and what I considered to be the silliness or the stupidity of their worldview was enough to repulse me back into embracing kind of the conservatism that I was raised within. Lovely people. I don't know why you do the things you do sometimes. Yes, I do, but you get what I mean. In about 2019, well, this was still actually 2018, I kind of fell into almost the early manosphere. This was kind of before Andrew Tate's rise to fame, and it was still kind of trendy back then to offer men dating advice. That was very trendy, and I actually watched those videos because I found that very interesting. And unfortunately for me, I became a little bit of a trad wife pick-me before Pearl got onto it, before other people got onto it. But deep down, a godly family, a godly marriage, and lots of kids was actually very important to me. And that became a massive influencer for a lot of my decisions that I made later on in life. I began looking up trying to conceive boards, even though there was not a man on site. I really started getting into birth and birth stories, kind of through the lens of I wanted to become a birth photographer, and I was thinking about the hustle like, oh, can I like get into this birth photography sphere because it's super interesting and birth is like super fascinating to me. And so that was kind of my framework of my inroad toward birth. And so I started listening to birth stories, YouTube videos, every YouTube video that was available on the internet I watched. I started listening to birth podcasts, the Birth Hour, Positive Birth Australia, just listening to hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of women's birth stories over a span of almost 5 years. And started really forming a strong opinion as I noticed common threads throughout these birth stories. That was... My opinions weren't just formed through basic internet research. In fact, I hadn't actually done much internet research. It was just formed through potentially 1,000 or so women's birth stories that I had listened to out of pure interest and hobby at the time. And so my first big interaction with birth was when I was booked as a birth photographer for my first and unfortunately only home birth. I would love to do more birth photography in the future. Maybe that might be on the cards next year. We'll see. And it was a woman who was a doula, and she was having a home birth with a medical midwife. And I think it was her 5th child. And they probably would have classified it as a geriatric pregnancy. But the space was really cool. Unfortunately, there seemed to be a lot of people there, and maybe that's her decision, but that kind of really seemed to impact her as pretty much as soon as I arrived and as soon as a few other people arrived, labour seemed to stall. And she went off to sleep. We slept on the floor. And then eventually she transferred to hospital, and because the baby was breached, they scheduled an elective C-section a couple of days later. And so that was kind of my first hands-on experience with birth. And so in this time, I was really forming and firming down on my opinion of birth. So my mum had an unmedicated hospital birth, which, kudos to her, is an achievement, especially in contrast to today's care and standards. And so I was kind of like, I'll do the same as my mum. I'll have a hospital birth, and it'll be safe because we're in the hospital, and it'll be nice and clean, and we have all the options available to us, and it'll be great. And then throughout all these birth stories, I started to realize, man, that seemed a little bit unnecessary. Oh man, they were so quick to jump to a VBAC there. And I realized that just by being within the hospital, it was so much easier to acquiesce to all the intervention available. Simply just being in the presence of it meant that I was so much more inclined to accept an epidural. And I knew that I'm someone who does not deal with pain well. I'm probably, in terms of pain thresholds, I'm the weakest person that I know. And I knew that given enough time and one suggestion of an epidural, I'd be like, yep, sign me up. And so, but I didn't want that because I knew the cascade of interventions that would eventually lead to a C-section. And I didn't want a C-section because I wanted a lot of children. And I knew that there were limits with how many kids you could have and the intervals that you could have them at if you ended up having a C-section. And I wanted a stack load of kids. So my birth plans became formulated around what do I do to avoid a C-section? And so I was like, well, it can't be in the hospital. So, well, maybe we'll do a birth center instead. And this to me seemed fantastic because you've got the accessibility and the safety of the hospital, but you've also got a nice, cozier environment. And I was like, well, you have to pay up front for a birth center. And I started noticing in these birth stories that the same level of intervention ended up happening. And at the slightest potentiality of risk, sure, some of them were valid, but at the slightest hint of risk, you were immediately transferred to the hospital. And I'm like, well, I don't want to do that because if I'm paying for a birth center, I want a birth center experience. And so I was like, oh, well, maybe I'll do home birth instead. And that works because then you don't have to like travel in, and I knew that to be a massive disruptor to the birth process. And then you didn't have to risk being turned away and that stalling your labor as well. And so I was like, all right, home birth with a medical midwife sounds great. And then I just kept hearing stories and stories and stories of women who were having that home birth experience. But every time the midwife walked in, no matter how crunchy, no matter how intentional they were, there was still a disruption to the birth space. Because as soon as someone with that medical background walked into the birth space, it changed things, no matter how hard they tried to avoid it. And I started noticing that as well. And massive credit to home birthing midwives. I would actually love to become an independent midwife in the future, and hopefully help facilitate a better way of birthing, because I 100% agree that like you get much better outcomes with an independent midwife at home than you do in hospital or birth center births. So massive credit to midwives there. But another factor that came into play was I realized my mum ran late with all of her pregnancies. We're talking 42, potentially almost 43 weeks. And this isn't exactly an issue in Australia or the state that I'm in Queensland. But in America, it's a massive issue if you run past 42 weeks. And it calls into license questions. Sometimes they're not able to attend. And then you just get some midwives who are just uncomfortable with that in general. So I was like, well, I don't want to put a midwife in the wrestle between having to wrestle between serving me and my desired birth outcomes or her potential future income, with her potentially losing her license in the future, because I know I'm naturally inclined to run later in my pregnancies because genetically that's what's happened with my 4 mothers. And so I had to wrestle with that as well, because I was like, oh, drats, what do I do? And then that's when the question of free birthing came up, and I started listening to hundreds of free birthing stories, and I was like, this is epic. Like the autonomy that you have in birth, not having to worry about if a midwife's going to rush to your door, the very fact that it's free, like not having to worry about dynamics in random strangers coming in and out of your hospital room. I'm much less inclined to ask for epidurals and stuff like that. And so I was like, oh, this seems like the fantastic answer. It's great. Because I think ultimately the biggest fear that I had about home birthing with a midwife was her allegiance to maintaining her license. And I didn't want to put a midwife in that position of wrestling with if she could continue caring with me or potentially dropping my care. The fact that she has policies and licenses and standards to uphold, standards that, depending on interpretation, may put you in a higher risk category, but may also not. And so in the sense with the birth center almost always easily transferring people, I didn't want to put a midwife in that situation either. And as well, it's expensive in Australia. To get a private independent midwife, it's quite expensive. By this time, I've finally met my future husband. And we're not even dating yet, but we're already talking about birth options with our kids. And he's super comfortable with a home birth. In fact, I think one of his cousins is a midwife. And I'm like, well, I want a bit more than a home birth, but sure, as long as you're happy that we're birthing at home, then I'm on board as well. And so that was fantastic. We get married in April of 2023, I think it is, 2023. And after years of like trawling through infertility subreddits and hearing about our friends struggling with infertility and the very fact that it took my parents 18 months to conceive me, I'm kind of like to my husband, can we start trying a little bit earlier? Because here's me expecting it's going to take maybe a year, 2 years, and quite anxious about that fact because I wanted to have a large family, and I'm almost in my mid-20s by this point. Like, if we're going to have a large family, we've got to get started. And so we have one cycle as a married couple And then the next we felt pregnant, actually trying. And that shouldn't have been a surprise, but it definitely was. And for most people, that would have been too early. And for us, it was probably a bit too early. But I definitely don't regret it. Yeah, I don't regret it at all. And so we start preparing for the birth. There's lots of questions to be had. In fact, he brought a bit of a substantial student loans into the marriage, and I was going full Dave Ramsey trying to get that paid off before our child arrived. So there was very little money that we had spare. I think I spent $50 on like some beef liver tablets, $500 on a NIPT test, and that was it. I think that's all that I spent in the entire pregnancy. We were that poor. Everything else was given to us by the church community, which praise the Lord for, because we would not have survived without, and our family. And so I don't want to, but on the encouragement of my mum and my husband, I go and get the blood test to confirm the pregnancy. I get your initial rounds of bloods that you get when you're pregnant. I get the NIPT test to find out the gender. Kudos to people who can wait until birth. I couldn't. I'm impatient like that. We find out we're having a boy, which is so exciting. And I was also a little bit worried about our family's potential to have twins, because twins are very heavily featured on both sides of our family. So, okay. I saw the doctor a few other times, and I just kept clashing with the doctor. He kept insisting that I needed to have the 6-week scan in order to actually go to the hospital. I knew that was a lie, and I didn't want any scans, to be honest, unless there was an issue. I didn't want any scans at all. I was open to the morphology scan, but that was about it. But he was like, no, you have to get this scan in order to go to the hospital. And I was like, internally like, well, I don't want to go to the hospital anyway, so I don't care. But I ended up transferring care to another GP. And that kind of missed the window for the 6-week scan. So that worked great for us. Kind of started seeing her regularly. Didn't really want to, but I was just doing it until we could get the NIPT test. And then my husband really wanted the 20-week morphology scan. And I knew that if I was going to get a scan, that would be the best one. I'd heard of the research against scans, and I wasn't comfortable with having one. But I was like, if I'm going to get one, that will be the one that I get. And so I saw my doctor long enough to get the morphology scan referral. We went there, and then after that, I kind of just dropped care with my doctor. I did see her one more. Well, just because she kept insisting about whooping cough. And I was fine with observatory interventions. So I was fine with taking bloods, fine with taking urine, stuff like that. I don't care. But stuff that interfered with the baby, I wasn't comfortable with. So scans, ultrasounds, shots, like the whooping cough shot, GBS testing I didn't want. Gestational diabetes tests I definitely did not want at all. So yes, I wasn't fine with those. And so after we had the ultrasound, I dropped care with her. I had some really odd nosebleeds a few weeks later. So I went and saw her once more at 27 weeks and was like, oh, sorry, kind of forgot. We were pretty busy as well. And it was a lot. Like, I mentally loved being pregnant. It was so cool. It's such a powerful thing, I think. It's the epitome of human creation, creating another human soul, knitting it together, being an instrument of God in that fact. It was awesome mentally, but physically it sucked. I didn't vomit much, but I just had constant 24/7 nausea. I dropped about almost 10 kilos in the first trimester, just because I could only really stomach one meal a day. So that was quite tough to navigate. We were also, not struggling financially. Well, we were struggling financially. It wasn't the greatest place. And so we would host like international students as a little bit of side cash, which comes into play later. I think also spiritually I was struggling. I'd underestimated how much of an impact being married would have on my personal and devotional life. I was out of sync with my Bible reading, and the exhaustion compounded so that it was really hard to read my Bible, which made me guilty about that. So I didn't, in a sense, interact as much in my prayer life, and so my spiritual life was really out of whack. And so all of that kind of contributed to our decision not to hire a private midwife. A, we couldn't afford it, and B, it was just too much. Like I was exhausted. There was too much going on to actually even properly think about the birth, which is not a great state to be in, especially when you're choosing to free birth and take all autonomy onto yourself. Now, going back a bit, the 20-week ultrasound, I didn't do for myself, I didn't do for the baby, I did for my husband. And I really struggled during it because little bub was obviously uncomfortable, definitely uncomfortable. He was definitely trying to avoid the ultrasound scanner, and I just remember almost crying and praying and being like, oh, like we just need to get through this, and I'll never do an ultrasound again. That's unnecessary. I just remember the little one just being in so much pain during that, and I hated that. So that was a lot to think about as well. And that definitely ratified my decision not to seek medical intervention for the last part of my pregnancy. And so we were hosting international students, which was a lot. We were trying to pay off debt. I was trying to wrap up at work. Because my mum went so late, I was like, well, I'll probably go late. So I'll probably go to 39 weeks working. So I was working full-time until 39 weeks and trying to deal with the handover there, which was a lot. So because we were trying to save money as well, I wasn't eating as well. Really bad food for you. And there was just a lot, and there was no space for me to sit down and lean into my intuition or think or reflect or even pray and have some time with God, which I think just really put me out of whack before the birth. My husband was also really uncomfortable with the idea of birthing completely solo, like just the two of us. And it was kind of a situation of like, what do we do in case of an emergency? So we decided to hire a birthkeeper, and she was a Christian. She was birthkeeping. She listened to the Freebirth Society. Like I loved the Freebirth Society at that time. And she could also do photography as well, which was just perfect. And in hindsight, what I should have done was more reflection about the space that she was to take and the role that she was to take on, because I was a little bit que sera with the whole thing. I hadn't given myself time to really think and dream about what the birth would be like, because I was like, oh, I know people get so disappointed and so disjointed when the birth doesn't go to plan. So I'm not going to plan a birth at all. Which in hindsight I deeply regret. Sit down, lean into your intuition. What do you want the birth to be like? Plan it around that. Seriously, don't be like me. Because I was way too loosey-goosey with it. And it was great because we met a few times in the lead up to the birth, and I actually attended a few free birth circles with her, which were great. I definitely, in future, I should have done that from the start. Like, attend your local birth circles. They're so important. The power of women's storytelling and just the advice that you can get from that is so, so important. So that was super helpful. About 33 weeks, my feet start dangerously swelling. Really large. And I was like, oh, it's just pregnancy swelling. But there were quite a few medical staff at our church who were a little bit concerned for me. They were like, oh, that's not too good. What does your doctor say? And I was like, my doctor is me. And I feel great. Like, I feel fine about it. So I was like, yeah, no, it's all good. But they were seriously swelling. I'll have to include a photo. So there was that. There was also, in the lead up to while I was pregnant, while I was pregnant, there were two quite integral births of people within the church who I became really close to later, that kind of filtered into my birth story as well. Number one, a woman at the church, she had preeclampsia and had to deliver her son really, really early, which resulted in a very long NICU stay and just a horrific fallout, which how she is alive today, massive kudos to her. And that weighed on me heavily. There was also a friend who had twins and was going through the MGP program who dearly wanted a home birth. We chatted all the time about it, but had twins and was wisely seeking out medical intervention for that, and ended up having a birth within the system, but trying to non-medically induce labour early because it wasn't looking good for one of the twins. And as a result, had a very hectic birth, but managed to still birth naturally, but with an epidural. And that was an interesting factor as well that later played into my own story. On top of that, bless my parents' souls, but as a baby present, they were getting us a demountable cabin to rent out so that could replace a little bit of my income and help hopefully allow me to stay on maternity leave a little bit longer. We have a paid maternity leave system here in Australia for the woman is about 90 days of minimum wage if you've worked up in the lead up to your birth. And it's good, it's better than nothing, but it realistically only would have allowed me to stay out of work for 5 months at best if I really stretched it out. And so my parents got us a cabin that we were to renovate, which was a lot. Add to the fact that, yes, we have no money already. We were also renovating this cabin. And so there was the stresses of that. There was the stresses of these international students who are doing wild things and being very silly. There was the stress of not sitting well with my pregnancy and allowing myself space for that. There was the stress of these other births in my community that hadn't gone entirely well. And then there was just the general birth stress of doing something that is culturally frowned upon. In all honesty, it's frowned upon to take complete autonomy over your own birth and not engage entirely with the medical system. And so all of that is compounding in the background in the lead up to my birth. I chose to work because I was expecting to run so late with my pregnancy. I chose to work up to 39 weeks. Do not do that. I will be stopping next time at least at 35 weeks, if not earlier, because that was way too much. And so I'm stopping in-person work at 39 weeks that was, let me see. So I stopped working on February the 14th. It's a Wednesday. We say goodbye to our international students on the Friday. The next Saturday, my husband and I move out of that main house because we figure it's more financially viable for us to live in this 7 meter by 3 meter cabin and rent out the main house or rooms of the main house. So we move out of the house on a Saturday. Someone moves in instantly that day. We're in a bit of a housing crisis, so there were people who were willing to move in. That was a lot. I am 39 and a half weeks on the Monday. And let me set the stage for you. We have not finished renovating the cabin yet. We don't have blinds up. We don't have aircon working. It's the tail end of a hectic summer. There's a lot going on. We haven't fully moved in yet. There's mess everywhere. So on the Sunday, one of my mum friends who is also pregnant goes into labour. On the Monday, we are running around Bunnings and IKEA. My husband is pushing me around on a trolley as we look for blinds and other things that we need for the cabin. And then Monday night, we go to bed at about 10:30. Oh no, it was even later, maybe 11:30 or even 12. And I wake up again at about 12:15 with some hectic sensations. So on the 19th of February, I went into labour straight away, and it was intense. It was about 511, maybe even sometimes 311 labour. Very high intensity straight from the start. I managed to go back to sleep against all odds, but I wake up again at about 2 a.m. and I have my bloody show. And from there, I can't go back to sleep. It is intense. It is coming on. It is time. And it's 100% straight from the start. So I'm like, oh, maybe this will be a very fast labour. Narrator, it was not a very fast labour. So I can't lie down. I can't sit. I can't squat. I can't lunge. I can't lie on my side. I can't lie on my other side. I can't do anything except stand. That was the best way for me to process getting through it. And the best option that I had was the shower. Hot water. The shower was the best relief that I would get. So here I am. Add to this, because it's a small hot water system, I had maybe 5 minutes of proper hot water before it needed an hour to reset and reload. So I would be in the shower for 5 minutes. I would get out of the shower. I would uncomfortably contort, stretch my way through, suffer through contractions for the next 55 minutes, and then I'd jump in the shower again. 5 minutes of relief, jump out. 5 minutes of relief, jump out, repeat for hours. And I just could not get into the sink of labour, which was really interesting because labour was always described to me as a gradual build. Yes, I'd heard of women who would have fast, intense labours, but there was somewhat a build. I didn't have that. It felt like I was plopped in the deepest of deep ends right from the get-go. And on reflection, after consulting with professionals, the opinion is that perhaps I was actually destined for a 3 to 6 hour labour, because my grandmother with my mum had a 20-minute labour. I think my mum had a relatively fast labour with me. So it seemed like I was actually destined for a shorter labour. Unfortunately, what I had later learned is that I can't remember if it was transverse or posterior, and it kind of almost apparently a bit of both. My baby was just not in the optimal positioning for the labour that I had engaged, that had already started. And so this was why I was so insanely uncomfortable. This is why I couldn't lie down. This is why I couldn't lunge, sleep, anything. So I am standing the entire time. My husband puts on a playlist to try and settle me. It's like piano hymns, like gentle piano hymns. And it's great because it's like this long list of incredibly awesome faith-filled songs. But I hear it repeat once. And then I hear it repeat twice. 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, on and on. And I start to realize this labour is getting a little bit long. So that was the Monday night to Tuesday morning. Around Tuesday midday, we call in the birthkeeper. She's 3 hours away, so she arrives mid-afternoon of the Tuesday. And once again, this is kind of where I went wrong in not properly assessing what part she would play in my birth, because I put too much emphasis on her being able to relieve my pain. I think what I was expecting was an epidural, but she can't facilitate that. And so in a sense, I was almost disappointed with the options that were provided. We tried Rebozo, we tried TENS. As soon as I entered into contraction, I was like almost screaming to rip the TENS machine off. It was difficult. I couldn't gain control. So eventually it gets to Tuesday night. I haven't been able to keep any food or fluids down the entire time that I've been in labour. My birthkeeper tries to get some rest. My husband is on shift with me. He eventually ends up falling asleep on the bed, and I let him because I'm like, I'm going to need him later. But it was great because in the silence of the early morning, just by myself, I was able to kind of finally think about the situation properly without the worried looks of all the people around me. And I was resolved within myself, all right, in the morning, once the people in the house are left, because we still had access to the house, I'm going to have a bath. And based on that, if it doesn't help progress anything, I think it's right to go into the hospital, which was massive for me because I hadn't registered my birth. I hadn't seen any of the hospital staff. I hadn't established relationships with them. I knew that I'd be getting substandard care and subpar care because of my decision to free birth and the criticism that would bring. And so that was a lot. And as well as that, I'd be on track to just get a C-section because of the inevitable cascade of interventions. I just needed pain relief. I needed a proper rest. And I was texting my friend, the one who had the twins and the epidural, and she's like, and this is a factor of why it's so important to be aware of the worldview and the preconceptions and opinions that people bring to birth, because she was like, you've been in labor for 2 days, you deserve your epidural, which at that time I really needed to hear that. Now, of course, I struggle with that, knowing the outcome of what the birth was like. But at that time, I needed to hear that, and that helped bring peace for the decision that I was about to make. And so we go into the house, we get access once the people have left, we have the bath. I don't feel great. I'm still not feeling great because not only am I so swollen that I can't have my wedding ring on, I'm also having not just stars in my eyes, but deep clouds of different color. Like I'm losing my vision. I'm also having like pain in my abdomen, and I'm just not feeling great. Like something deeply intuitively doesn't feel right. And I think it's right that we transfer to the hospital. Praise God for this. My birthkeeper calls in a midwife who she knows. And praise God for this midwife, because it really helped bring a lot of peace to my birth. That I didn't immediately go to the hospital, that we had reasonable advice from someone who was a little bit within the system, but not entirely. And so we call her in, and she takes my blood pressure, and she looks sick. I think I was like 160 over 90. Like it was shockingly high, and she takes it multiple times until my arm starts to hurt. And she's like, this is not good. I hate making fear-based decisions, and I cry every time I send a family to the hospital, but you need to go in now. You have to go in. She's like, your symptoms are consistent with preeclampsia, which is very dangerous. And we put it down to that. She gave us some advice and opinions about what to do. We go in under the pretense of just, it's been a long labor, we'd like some pain relief and to go home. She guessed that I was probably only about 2 to 3 centimeters. She didn't check me because she knew it wasn't right for her to check me. But she figured that I was probably 2 to 3 centimeters and that we had a bit of a way to go, but that she knew that they would pick up the preeclampsia and we'd get appropriate care, like we would get hypertensives to address that, and from there we could make decisions. So we go into the hospital, and controversial, of course, we get a little bit of like a sideways glance when we turn up. They think I'm not super far along based on like how I'm taking it, how I'm processing it. My husband, bless his soul, is a brass and woodwinds tutor, and he's very good at breathing, and so that was getting me through. The breath work was impeccable. I'm telling you, that was one of the best pain relief options I had aside from the shower. It's just like stuff like that, just for hours on end. And so they don't think I'm very far along, but I eventually get checked. Oh, you're 8 centimeters. I guess you're going to the birthing ward. And I was like, awesome, I'm 8 centimeters. How great. So we go into the birthing ward. My mum turns up, even though I originally didn't want her at the birth. It was fantastic that she did turn up because she just like fought off the doctors. And it was long. So we ended up, I think we left for the hospital about just before 12 and then ended up getting admitted about an hour and a half later. And we're in the birthing ward, and this is everything that I didn't want, but just had to deal with. And we're just hoping to get the epidural so I can get some rest. So we're just here trying to get the epidural, the stupid epidural. And I think it's about 4 hours later, maybe about 3:30. I'm like, please just check me. I just want to get the epidural. And yeah, I think it was about 3:30. And they were like, oh, no epidural for you. You're 10 centimeters. It's time to push. And I was like, what? Which was a lot, because it's like, why the heck did I go into the hospital? On top of that, we didn't get hypertensives. We didn't get that. So, oh yeah, and the laughing gas didn't work on me because I didn't breathe properly, because I was just in so much pain and disfocus that I didn't follow the instructions properly. So I gave up on the laughing gas. And so it's like, we go to the hospital for pain relief. There's no pain relief there. We go to the hospital for hypertensives. We don't get them. And I'm 10 centimeters now, so it's time to push. I didn't feel pushy for hours. Actual hours. Maybe it was about 6 o'clock that we actually got the 10 centimeters. Yeah, I think it was about 6 o'clock. I didn't feel pushy. I kept being asked. I did like a few practice squats. They're like, oh, so are you feeling it? I'm like, well, like I feel like a motion to bed, but I've never pushed. What do you expect of me? They tried giving me Pitocin. I refused 100 times. They were really insistent on a cannula. I refused, but because I had preeclampsia, we've now got to put it in. I requested to go into the birth pool, but they're like, oh no, you're high risk with preeclampsia, so we can't. Never mind the fact that birth pools help reduce blood pressure, which was the main issue here. So there were so many things building up, and they were also using CTG monitoring because I refused the fetal clip, which is actually a screw. I was like, don't you dare. Oh yes, in my notes, patient is being difficult. So I refused that, and then about maybe 8:30ish, maybe 9 o'clock, I kind of said it earlier, I was like, yeah, I think I feel pushy. And so from there they started recording, all right, patient is pushing. And about 9 o'clock they get concerned because they're starting to have some light decels from baby. Nothing that's super abnormal, but that's there. And from there they're like, all right, you need to hurry up because baby's in distress and we need to use forceps or vacuum soon. And I was like, absolutely not. So my husband and I, we turn off the lights and we kind of almost lock ourselves. You can't lock yourself, but that was the vibe we were going for, in the bathroom. And just the two of us, and I'm trying to scream and force this baby out. And of course, every time my heart rate jumps, a bunch of doctors run into the room, disturbing the process even more. There's my OB that's been last minute assigned to me, bless her for dealing with me, but also what the heck woman who's like got her arms crossed and standing in the corner glaring at me because I keep refusing Pitocin / syntocin. That's what we call it in Australia. Oh no, it's just an artificial oxytocin. No, I don't want it. And so the crown of fire, feeling that, I almost get the head out. I just wanted to feel the fetal ejection reflex. That was one of the main things that I wanted for the birth. But no, here I am, intentionally forcing my baby out before he's due. And so he comes out. He's fine. Add this to the story. So, earlier in the day, we're asked about some of our birth preferences, and I'm like, man, I have a long list, but I can't summarize it here. And so, pretty much, what do you want to do with the placenta? Well, we want to have a lotus birth. Well, you don't have the things for a lotus birth. Okay, well, we want delayed cord clamping until the cord's white. All right, who do you want to catch the baby? Me or my husband? Okay. She turns to my husband. All right, well, I'll catch the baby and you can put your hands on mine as I bring him up. So I'm about to push my son out and I can feel he's my husband is not where he's supposed to be. Turns out he'd been pushed aside by the midwives as my baby is coming. So they are trying to reach for my baby. I push their hands away and catch him myself, which feels like such a victory to this day. Small, but a small victory. And I just hold him to my chest, and they're trying to get the cord around from his neck. It's not tight. He's fine. And they kind of just push me over along to the bed to lie down. And out of this dark space that we were in, dark, safe, small space that we're in, there's like 5 people in there with flashlights and stuff. Now you're going to the bed where all the lights are on you. Okay, but I have my baby with me, and I'm just so weak. And I had no energy to fight when I needed to fight over the next hour. And that will be my biggest regret to this day, that I didn't fight for my son when I needed to the most. Okay, I have to come back to this because my camera is about to run out of battery. I'm sorry, I didn't want a part 2, but maybe I'll share the rest of it next week. Thanks for coming. I'll see you soon.